Okay, welcome back. We are now going to discuss the U.S. foreign policy establishment. So let me pull up those slides. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is going to be our first, again, normally this would be the first week of class, but since we're on an abbreviated schedule, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we want to think about how foreign policy is made in the United States, and how it works generally, and what are the key actors and how bargaining works between the key actors. And then what we want to do is to dive down and to look at each of these actors more specifically, and then to look at how policy is designed and then implemented with the bureaucracy. So first question is, how is foreign policy made in the United States? So the way the framers designed the United States is that the US system allows for both the executive and the legislative branch to make foreign policy. The judicial branch is allowed to veto aspects of foreign policy and declare them unconstitutional, but typically it does not get involved in foreign policy. Foreign policy is typically the realm of the executive and the legislative, and much more so the executive branch. But it does create this really interesting dynamic because foreign policy is not the exclusive domain of either the executive or the legislative branch. There is no norm that one branch is supposed to have total autonomy over the other in terms of foreign policy. It's also the case that war power, again, in terms of the document of the Constitution, lies with the legislative branch. They are the branch that has the power to declare war. Now, that's been eroded gradually since World War II, where the executive has taken more of a dominant role in foreign policy decision making. That really is a product of the post-war period. Prior to that, executives did engage in foreign policy, but not to the extent that they do now. Now, again, the executive has a much more dominant role in foreign policy. And again, it's not to say that prior to World War II, the executive did nothing and that it was totally in the hands of Congress. Gradually, over time, the power of war making has shifted from Congress to the executive. That's been a trend. It really accelerated after World War II. It's been slowed by partisanship, effectively, which we'll see in a minute. That what really slows how much power the executive gets versus not is really a function of, does the president's party line up with the parties that are controlling the legislative branch. So let's first think about the key actors here. The first one is the presidency. There's no actor that is more significant in American foreign policy than the presidency. Now, you notice I'm talking about this as an institution, right? I don't want to talk about this in terms of Obama or Trump, right? Those are the individuals that will occupy the presidency. But the way the system is designed is whoever is occupying the presidency gets these powers. So we want to think about generally, what does the presidency do? The presidency is given autonomy over the foreign policy agenda and the direction of U.S. foreign policy. So what does that mean? It means the tone of U.S. foreign policy, the objectives of U.S. foreign policy, the strategies, all of that is housed within the executive branch. So when you look at this picture here, you see former President Obama and President Trump. The agenda of the United States really changed as the presidency shifted from one of these presidents to the other one. The Obama administration was much more interested, for example, in tying the United States both militarily and economically to Asia, where the Trump administration has adopted a much more different tone, which is more of a system of trying to allow the United States to have much more autonomy, free from foreign entanglements. And if the United States is going to get engaged in foreign entanglements, other states should, in a sense, pay more for U.S. protection, right? So that's a very different agenda. And the tone of U.S. foreign policy and the objectives and what, since the U.S. was trying to do in the world, that fundamentally changed. From the Obama administration to the Trump administration, the Obama administration's key objective was the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Southeast Asia. From the Trump administration, suddenly U.S. foreign policy changed from that and started to look at unilateral deals between many of these states within Southeast Asia. So that's a key part of the presidents. They set the tone, they set the objectives, right? They set the agenda, which is a key part of power, right? If you take any classes in political science, you know that agenda setting power is really a key aspect to this. What they also do is reactive, right? Whenever there is a challenge coming from abroad, the presidency is the entity that's supposed to respond to it. So if you just take COVID-19, the entity that everybody looked to try to navigate, build, coordinate an American response, that fell to the presidency, right? And that's how it's supposed to work, is that the presidency is supposed to take control and take and adopt the leadership agenda over foreign policy challenges. They would do that if the challenge was a foreign aggressor. They would do it if it was a terrorist organization. So after 9/11, the Bush administration led the response of the United States. It didn't fall to Rudy Giuliani. It didn't fall to Governor Pataki. It fell to the president. So the presidency, and it didn't fall to Congress. The president is the entity that's supposed to respond to foreign challengers. It's also the entity that's supposed to negotiate and form international agreements and generally represent the United States on the global stage. Now, underneath the presidency, underneath the group of advisors that the president has, the presidency has a large network of bureaucracies that, given information, actually implement the policies that the United States adopts. So the United States, for example, has the State Department, the CIA, the NSA, USAID, the Department of Defense, and various other entities that operate underneath the executive branch. So when the executive decides to do anything, right, if the executive wants to pursue a policy where it militarily challenges, say, China, it would fall to the State Department, the CIA, and the DoD to actually implement that, right? The president themselves doesn't do, the president herself or himself doesn't actually do that. They make this decision and then falls to the bureaucracies to actually do the implementing of that, right? So that's the first entity that we have in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The next one we have is Congress. Both the House and the Senate, the U.S. is bicameral, so it has a House and a Senate. Both of them can enact policy. Both of them can engage in foreign policy, even though traditionally they don't, right? The most important power that both of these branches have, right, the House and the Senate, and that Congress generally has, is the power of the purse. Congress controls the money. Nothing gets done without the money. You can't operate a military operation abroad without having the funding for it, right? Congress has control over that, right? Congress designates how much money is given to the executive and to the bureaucracies to actually initiate foreign policy and actually enact foreign policy. Now, the Congress, the House and the Senate both have several committees and subcommittees that give them information about what is actually going on in the world, right? They gain their information through things like the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, et cetera, and they also have ties with the executive where the leaders of the CIA, the leaders of the State Department brief congressional representatives on what's going on in the world. Now, the third entity is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court cannot propose any foreign policy, but it can veto foreign policy if a particular policy is challenged. So, for example, during the Obama administration, there was a drone attack on an American citizen in Yemen. That was argued as a claim that the United States, that was an extrajudicial killing, and the United States did not have the right to do that. So that's something that can be challenged. What can also be challenged is the housing of detainees at Guantanamo, which the United States did during the War on Terror. That can be challenged in the Supreme Court, and in theory, the Supreme Court can veto a foreign policy action in that way. Now, a hypothetical here is, like, suppose the United States decided to reinstitute the draft. The draftee could challenge this and go to the Supreme Court and say that this is an illegal foreign policy action. So, moving on. So let's think about executive-legislative relations, right? This has been an interesting dynamic because gradually, again, more autonomy has been ceded from the legislature to the executive. During World War II, Congress basically became acquiescent to the president. In the post-Vietnam period, Congress tried to restrain some of the presidency and contain what was called the imperial presidency. In the post-Cold War, we've seen a mixed record that is typically a function of partisanship. If the partisan alignment of the presidency lines up with Congress, there tends to be more deferment to the executive, where if it's the opposite, if you have competing parties in Congress versus the presidency, Congress tries to restrain the president much more. Now, that changed post 9/11 temporarily, where Congress became acquiescent to start, and then later Congress became much more assertive. More recently, what we've seen is a very heavy politicization of foreign policy that, I don't think it's ever been completely apolitical. There's an old statement that politics starts at the water's edge. I don't think it's ever been true in the United States. But we've seen much more of a politicization of foreign policy recently. I think most experts would concur with that. Now let's think about how foreign policy is made. The first move is the president. It comes from the president, because remember, the president controls the agenda. So the president decides whether or not to propose some change to the status quo or not. The House and the Senate can decide whether or not to veto this, right? So suppose a president wants to initiate a lot more money, a lot more spending for operations in the war on terror or an anti-ballistic missile system. They could propose such a thing, but the House and the Senate have to decide whether or not they want to veto that, because they have that power. They can veto anything that the president proposes. And so if they choose to veto these things, there is no change. Now, again, this is referring to general policy shifts. This isn't crisis behavior. We'll get to crisis behavior as we move forward. What we think about with these decision makings is that these are decisions to approve military aid to a country, decisions to increase or decrease defense spending, decisions to fund ABM, decisions to fund any sort of operation that the United States wants that's more general, right? Those are foreign policy decisions that Congress actually has a role to play in. So let's think about how the president might respond to these things. Presidents have limited political capital. If the president does nothing, the amount of capital the president has remains the same. If a president tries to change policy, the president will lose capital if it fails and potentially gain some if it succeeds. So if a president enacts a foreign policy change and it gets enacted, the president looks better, right? Can point to the accomplishment when re-election time comes around. But if it fails, then the president will lose capital. Therefore, what we'll see is the president is going to behave strategically. If they believe that change is possible, she's going to propose changes. If she doesn't believe that it's possible, then she'll refrain from proposing changes, right? If there's no chance that policy can be changed, then he or she will stop, and he or she will not propose any sort of change. So let's look at an example. Suppose we have a president that wants to increase spending in the war on terror. The status quo at the start of the war on terror is that Congress is spending zero on counterterrorism operations. The president wants to significantly increase to 160 billion. Interestingly, in government speak, nothing really matters unless you're speaking in terms of billions, right? Millions, nobody really cares. Billions is when people start paying attention. So suppose you have a president that wants to increase the budget in the war on terror from 0 to 160 billion, right? That's the president's ideal point. Now, the president's not going to get that, right? Because we see that the Senate and the House have different preferences. In the Senate, when we aggregate up all the preferences of the senator, the best that the Senate is going to do is to offer 120 billion, right? That's the Senate's ideal point. And the House wants a figure that's even lower. The House is only going to go to 70 billion. Now, the further we get away from these ideal positions, the worse off a particular actor is. So if the House adopts the Senate's proposal, it prefers its own proposal, so it's in a sense less happy than it would be if it got 70 billion. And it's even less happy, it's the least happy if nothing happens, because the difference between 70 billion and zero is 70 billion, right? So, and the difference between the House's proposal and the Senate's proposal is 120 billion. So we have 50 billion on this side, we have 70 billion on this side. The House should prefer the Senate's proposal to nothing, right? Because we assume that as you move away from the ideal point, you're worse off. Same thing here with the Senate. The Senate is willing to, it prefers the president's proposal, which is 40 billion more than its ideal point, to the House's proposal, which is 50 billion less. And it prefers both of these things to the status quo, which are zero, right? So the further away we move from these different ideal points in either direction, the worse off a player is, right? So in this case, if we look at this set of preferences, the Senate should prefer the president's proposal of 160 billion, because that's only 40 billion away from its own ideal proposal, to the House's proposal, which is 50 billion less. So let's remember, the president is the one setting the agenda. The president demands 160 billion. However, the House and the Senate are different. The House is only willing to go to 70 billion, right? The Senate's willing to go up to 120 billion, but in a sense prefers not to go any further, right? So the question is the House going to prefer the president's proposal to nothing, right? The president's proposal is 90 billion away from the House's ideal point. The zero is 70 billion away from the House's ideal point. So the House will prefer nothing to the president's proposal. And if that's true, the president is in fact constrained by the House. So the president is not a king. The president cannot get exactly what he or she wants. The president is going to be constrained by the other two houses in Congress, especially because these are the entities that control the money. So let's suppose, again, if we're approving a budget for the war on terror in Iraq, the president wants their $160 billion proposal. If that's true, if that's what the president proposes, the House will just say, no, thank you, and we'll say, we'll just approve no money at all. Now, since this is the worst possible outcome for the president, because that's zero compared to their ideal point of 160 billion, the president's going to have to come up with something else. The alternative for the president is to adopt the Senate proposal. That's only 40 billion off the president's ideal proposal, so this is preferable to zero. It's also preferable to the House's proposal. And from the House's perspective, that's only 50 billion over what their ideal point is, which is 50 billion less on this side, 70 billion less on this side. The House prefers the Senate proposal to nothing. The president prefers the Senate proposal to nothing, and the Senate prefers its own ideal point. And so in that sense, we see that the Senate's proposal is going to be our winning number here, right? If we continue going on this, it says the proposal that's going to win out in the budget for Iraq is the Senate's ideal point, which is 120 billion. The Senate here is the median voter. The median voter generally tends to win in terms of these spatial models. But we see if we look at how the budget works, again, the president is not an elected king. He or she can't get everything she wants. She's going to have to be constrained by what the House wants because the House can veto the whole thing. So the president has to move to a less enticing proposal, but one that's still better than the status quo. Okay, now let's look at a second example. Let's assume that the House and the presidency are both controlled by Republicans while the Senate is controlled by Democrats. Now let's look at this as we're trying to understand and trying to predict what spending for anti-ballistic missile defense will be. What we can see here is that the status quo is that the United States is spending $7 billion on anti-ballistic missile defense. Whichever president this is wants to increase that fairly significantly to $56 billion. The House is willing to go along to some extent, and their ideal point is $40 billion. But the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats, wants to cut the budget from $7 billion to $3 billion, right? So we see something that's a little bit different here. Suppose the president proposes $56 billion. The Senate will veto that. Suppose the House prefers $40 billion, and suppose the president then says, okay, well, if you can't give me $56 billion, I'll move to $40 billion. The Senate will still veto that, right? Because their preference is still to stay at the status quo versus to go all the way to the House's proposal. In fact, what we see is that gradually this is going to come down to the status quo, right? The status quo spending is $7 billion. The House and the president want to increase it significantly, but the Senate wants to cut it. So what's going to end up happening is that because this proposal right here is too much, the House's proposal is too much for the Senate. What's going to end up happening is gradually the two parties are going to navigate towards the status quo, which is in the middle. So again, what we see here is that the president is not an elected king. The president is constrained by the Senate here. The House is willing to go along with them, but the president is constrained by the Senate that wants to cut the budget. So what the president should do in this case is just not propose anything at all, just to accept the $7 billion in the status quo, because that is preferable to the Senate's proposal of cutting $3 billion. What this should tell you is that Congress can both constrain the president and that it's difficult to change policy in the United States because all of the parties have to line up and favor a change, right? When it comes to these big monetary issues, there are real constraints on what the president can and can't do. Now, a question that then might be, is radical change even possible in the United States? Well, let's take the same example of anti-ballistic missile defense. Let's suppose that control over the Senate flips and it moves to Republican control. Now, both the House and the Senate are in favor of a $40 billion increase, where the president proposes the $56 billion increases. Now, because all the branches line up, we can see radical change. The difference between the House and Senate's ideal point of $40 billion to $7 billion is $33 billion. The difference between the president's proposal and the House and Senate's proposal is $16 billion. So if the president were to propose his or her ideal point of $56 billion, that would be accepted. All the branches would line up, and we do see a radical increase in spending for anti-ballistic missile defense. So it is possible for radical change to happen in the United States, but that can only happen if the House, Senate, and President all line up in terms of the same party and in terms of the same preferences. So that's something to bear in mind. Unless that happens, unless you have three branches of government, or unless you have three entities of government, the House, the Senate, and the President, all lined up with the same party, there is no radical change. It only takes one of them to stop radical change, which means that you don't typically see radical change in the United States. So what that tells you, if we think about this just in the aggregate, is that US foreign policy, in terms of these big issues and in terms of how money is allocated, is actually fairly stable. The only exception to this is going to be when one party dominates all branches, right? Partisan alignment is your key predictor for why Congress sometimes seems docile, right? Why it sometimes is willing to cede power to the president, and why it's sometimes assertive in other periods, right? Congress tends to be assertive when it's trying to constrain the president. Our docile periods are post-World War II and the lead up to Iraq, and we see some assertive periods like post-Vietnam and during the Clinton administration. What we can see also is that 2017 to 2018 was a time of more significant change, because that's when all of the key players lined up in terms of partisan alignment. Whereas now, where one entity, the House, is under the control of the Democrats, we see more contention over change, right? And that's a key predictor in how US foreign policy and the stability of it, how it changes, how radically it can change, et cetera. Now, what's interesting in this is that none of this is really a function of public opinion, right? This is a function of where Congress is, where the president is, and where those preferences come from. Now, where do these preferences come from? Well, they probably come from public opinion. They probably come from the constituents of these different entities. We're going to talk more about public opinion and how it influences policy tomorrow. But what I do want to do is to go over some empirical patterns in public opinion with you, just because they may be of interest and they may spark some of the discussion on the discussion forum. So in theory, the way public opinion should work in the United States is something called a principal-agent relationship. The idea here is that the public doesn't necessarily have the capability to conduct foreign policy on their own. As I mentioned, most people in the public are busy with other things, right? They don't necessarily have the ability to do foreign policy, so they hire agents to do it for them. So in theory, if the agent is doing a bad job, the principal can fire him, right? Make a sports analogy. Think about your favorite athlete. Your favorite athlete typically has an agent that negotiates for them with the team for a contract. If that agent is doing a poor job of negotiation, or if that agent gets a contract that doesn't really satisfy that particular player, or if other players start to get better contracts very soon after that player gets their contract, the player can fire that agent and find a different agent. If you want to make that analogy to US foreign policy, suppose the US public hires a representative or an executive. If that executive does a poor job, they can kick them out of office and remove them. So the public is going to hire an agent to conduct policy for them generally. The agent that's most responsible for foreign policy here is the president. And the president is therefore responsible for producing what you can call good policy outcomes. What that means is subjective, but each individual is going to look at whether or not the president is doing a good job for them when they decide whether or not to support the president or not. And if they don't do a good job in the eyes of each of these individuals, which is really has a lot of heterogeneity, which is really diverse, right? Since what people think is good, right? If they don't do a good job, then they're going to get fired at election time, or an individual is going to vote against them at election time. Now, let's look at how this works, right? In theory, again, if an incumbent doesn't do a good job, they'll get fired. But here's some interesting data. If you look at how often individuals get replaced, how often politicians get replaced in the United States, what you'll see from these data is not a whole lot, right? Most representatives just stay there, right? Their general election success rate for representatives in 2016 is 98%. Most of them don't go anywhere. And if we look at the entire post-World War II period, 94% of representatives win re-election. Nobody's going anywhere, right? The public's not really having a whole lot of influence over these individuals. The same is true of the Senate, right? 84% of senators in the post-World War II period won re-election, right? And if we look at governors, it's 78%. Presidencies, we don't have as much data as we do on representatives and senators, but what we can see is that in the post-war era, there's only been 3 presidents that have failed to win re-election. And that's Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and George Bush, the first George Bush. Those are the ones that failed in the re-election bid. Everybody else got re-elected except for Kennedy, who was assassinated. But it looked like he was well on track to be re-elected as well, right? What this tells you is that there is a very significant incumbency advantage in the United States. Publics don't tend to change leaderships, right? Presidents tend to win re-election. That's very, very close to being, since it's a very high probability event that presidents are going to win re-election. They don't always, right? We can see that there's some cases where they didn't, but it takes quite a bit of effort to try to get an executive to lose. I'd say roughly it's about 85% of presidents are going to win re-election. So it's difficult to change incumbents. It can happen, it's possible, but it's not likely, right? So that's just what we see. That has significant implications for punishments, right? If it's true that executives and just politicians generally are supposed to respond to the public because there's this fear of punishment, it doesn't look like they're getting punished a whole lot, right? That's just something we see from the data. Now, so that's something to bear in mind. How much influence does the public actually have over their politicians? You can kind of see this pattern if you follow the data and public trust in government, right? What we can see is that prior to the Nixon administration, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, public trust in government was approaching 80%. Since the Johnson administration, which is the Vietnam era, you see that public trust in government has gradually trended downward, right? Certainly it did during the Nixon administration, Ford, during Carter. It goes back up in the Reagan administration and then levels off, spikes up during the first Bush administration during the Gulf War, and then goes down significantly. Gradually makes its way back up to George W. Bush, sees a spike during the War on Terror, and then has trended downward ever since. Since the War on Terror, public trust in government is just gradually trending down. Now, the question is, what does the public want? Right, there was a study done by the Eurasia Group that was surveying the American public to see what they want this was in 2018. And you can look at the demographics of the survey. They basically are balanced, right? The income distribution seems to follow the normal US income distribution, though there's a slightly more sampling in people over 200,000. Age distribution is balanced. Political parties are relatively balanced, so trending more Democratic, or tending more people that self-identify as Democratic. And region-wise, we see more South Atlantic and Pacific participants, but basically it's balanced. When we look at these data, what we can see, here's one question from it, which is, America is, the responses were exceptional because of what it represents, not an exceptional nation, exceptional because of what it's done for the world. What you see is that Republicans tend to believe that America is exceptional because of what it represents. Democrats less so. Independents are relatively balanced here. What we can see is that Democrats tend to say, or tend to respond, that the United States is not an exceptional nation. Every country has attributes which distinguish it. Fewer Republicans are doing that. In terms of exceptional for what it has done for the world, again, that's more of a Republican response too. The majority of people, though, the majority of respondents said that America is exceptional because of what it represents. That's interesting. Americans tend to view the United States as being exceptional. Not everybody does that, right? Not everybody thinks that the United States is exceptional, but most Americans tend to view the United States in that way. We can also look at some views of leadership, right? The question was, which of the following expresses your view? A great leader should try to change the world. A great leader must lead by example. In the real world, any leader must often choose between the least of many bad options. What you see is that Americans tend to be more pragmatic. Most Americans, only about 10.5%, are saying that leaders should try to change the world. Most Americans are saying great leaders must lead by example, and that any leader must choose the least of bad options, right? That's 30% there. So again, most Americans seem to want leaders to lead by example and are not looking for leaders to radically change the world. When we look at what the American public looks at as the greatest threats, this is interesting too. What we see is that the modal response here is that the greatest threat to America will face is a rise in populist and authoritarian governments that threaten democracy, human rights, and the rule of law across the world, right? There's less of a focus on losing identity due to a high level of immigration or trade wars. And we see that there is some concern about Americans becoming distrustful of democratic institutions. What's interesting here is that most Democrats seem to believe that the rise of populism and authoritarian governments are the biggest threat that the United States will face. Republicans seem to focus more on this loss of national identity, though a significant amount also responded because of populist and authoritarian tendencies. The next question was, peace is best achieved and sustained by the U.S. by the best, since the most frequent response here was keeping a focus on the domestic needs and the health of American democracies while avoiding unnecessary intervention beyond the borders of the United States. What I want to say here is what's interesting is that if we look at most recent data, most Americans don't tend to be overly enthusiastic about foreign intervention. That number has even gone down since the war on terror. Most Americans are not interested in doing things like Iraq again or doing things like Afghanistan again. Most Americans don't tend to want that type of stuff. And actually, you can see that reflected. You can actually, I think, see that more reflected in political discourse now too, right? You can see that fewer Americans are supportive of highly interventionist foreign policy. That bears out in the data here as well. Finally, one thing I think that it's worth bearing in mind too is that younger people tend to be less likely to favor a highly interventionist foreign policy. People under 30 were the most likely to want the United States to abstain from intervening to stop human rights abuses. That wasn't necessarily true 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, there might have been more enthusiasm for the United States serving as what was called the world policeman, or trying to resolve problems in the world. That's less likely to be the case amongst younger people now, right? We're less likely to see people that are old, that want the United States to intervene in the world. What we can see is that since more people favor restraint, when it comes to being UN-led, we see people over 60 are more likely to be supportive of that they're willing to see the United States intervene in the world if the mission is UN-led. And US-led alone, again, you just see less enthusiasm for that generally. Now, what's interesting here to look at these data is that in addition to looking at these sort of estimates of what the US wants based on this opinion poll data, what we get is that younger people don't tend to favor intervention, but generally Americans are not likely to favor intervention anymore, right? That they're more likely to favor restrained foreign policy. But look at these data, right? The question was, in the case of a Russian attack on a NATO ally, what should people do, right? 95% of foreign policy experts said that the United States should favor retaliation or should seek retaliation. Only 54.2% of the public thought that. That tells you that there is a significant divide between foreign policy experts and the public, right, in terms of how they view foreign policy. That, I think, is interesting, especially if you go back to that idea of the principal-agent relationship. The public is entrusting these experts to try to conduct foreign policy on their behalf. But these experts don't tend to agree necessarily completely with what the public want. There is overlap there. It's not a complete diametric opposite preferences. But what we can see is that the public is responding to this question quite a bit differently than the foreign policy experts do. And that's interesting, right? What that means is something we'll get into in the coming lectures, but we do see that there is a discrepancy in what the two sides tend to think, right? And when we can also look at how the United States should respond to humanitarian abuses, again, you can see experts are less likely to favor restraint than the public. When it comes to UN-led operations, the public is much more likely to favor that versus experts. And when it comes to US-led operations alone, unilateralism, experts are much more likely to favor that than the public. So we see really considerable differences in how experts view appropriate responses to humanitarian abuses versus the general public. Again, that discrepancy is something that's interesting that we're going to explore more as we move forward. Now, the final thing I want to get into to try to sort of think about is how does the rest of the world view the United States? Based on these data, you can see that when it comes to the current view of the United States, generally it's favorable. Generally, more people view the United States favorably than unfavorably, but there doesn't tend to be a whole lot of confidence in President Trump in particular. You can see that 27% of the globe has confidence in Trump, whereas 70% does not. That's probably expected given Trump's commitment to unilateralism and to some extent isolationism. But generally, there's a favorable view of the United States. There's generally a belief that the United States respects the personal freedoms of its people. There's not a strong belief that the United States really takes into account the interests of other countries. And right now, it doesn't seem to be the case that the United States is really doing a good job of addressing global problems. That's right now in the spring of 2018. And it's unlikely that those data have shifted all that much in the last year and a half. But what's interesting here also is that if we look at these data, how does the world believe that the United States is doing as a global leader? When we look at these data, it seems overwhelmingly, the world seems to prefer the United States being the world's leading power to the alternative of China, which is really the only viable alternative that's out there, unless we consider the EU, which is a non-unitary state. So right now, if we look at how the world views the United States as a world leader, even if there's less confidence in U.S. leadership at the current moment, even if there's less confidence in the United States and how it's performed in previous conflicts, and again, I don't want to be completely targeting the Trump administration here, even if there's views of the United States where the United States has done things wrong, generally today, people seem to favor the United States being the world's leading power in comparison to China. There's a few exceptions. Tunisia seems to strongly prefer China. Argentina barely prefers China, it looks like, right? There's some competition in South Africa, right? But generally, and same in Mexico, which is interesting. But generally, if we look at it, the bulk of since the people surveyed here tend to favor the United States being in that position of world leader, right? So the rest of the world seems to, from based on this, if we look at the median of this, seems to want and prefer U.S. leadership. So does the United States. 88% of Americans favored continued U.S. leadership as well. So if we look at some general patterns, what we get is that overall confidence in the representativeness of government to represent the views of the U.S. public and foreign policy, that seems to be on the decline. We see that there's a gap between the views of experts and non-experts in terms of expectations of foreign policy. What we also see is that younger Americans tend to be less interventionist. That seems to be something that has changed in the previous decades. But interestingly, politicians don't change. Those are the same group of politicians that have been there before. They tend to have the same attitudes. Attitudes don't rapidly change. And we see that there's still appetite for U.S. global leadership. So next time, tomorrow, we're going to be talking about how does public opinion, which seems to be changing slightly to some extent, looking at less intervention, how does that influence politicians that are still thinking the same way, that don't tend to turn over all that much? And how much of a change are we actually seeing? How stable is U.S. public opinion? So next time we'll talk about how stable it is, how does it translate into policy, and what gets politicians to actually listen to Americans that are demanding particular foreign policies. So we'll talk about that next time. I would be sure to contribute to the discussion forum if we get a chance today. If not, hopefully we'll get your contributions tomorrow, and I will talk to you then.